Alright class, for this video we will focus mainly on the home front during World War I. Looking at getting support for the war with George Creel and the Committee on Public Information. Taking a look at enforcing loyalty and putting down dissent. And then how to prepare for the war and what's our plan for mobilization. If we have time after that, we will look at women and suffering until suffrage and forging a war economy. So let's get started here with getting support for the war. So the war effort led the government to mobilize more than just troops and raise an army. We have to mobilize public opinion as well. And so just 8 days after the declaration of war, President Wilson established something called the Committee on Public Information, and it composed of the Secretaries of State, War, and the Navy. The head of this Committee on Public Information was a Denver newsman by the name of George Creel. Creel got the head of the Committee on Public Information because he told Wilson, or sold Wilson on the idea, that the best approach to influencing public opinion was propaganda instead of censorship. Wilson had some ideas of, he wanted the government to be able to censor the newspapers, and when we look at other areas of how the government mobilized for the war effort, Wilson definitely wants the government to have a heavy hand in that. But Creel says instead of censoring and telling people what they can and can't say all the time, why don't we just use a propaganda machine and rouse up public support for the war? And so Creel organized a propaganda machine to explain the Allies' war aims to the people, and then above all to the enemy, where it might help sap their morale. To generate support for the war, the CPI gathered journalists, photographers, artists, entertainers, and others for any purpose that might be deemed useful for the war effort. For instance, film divisions featured movies such as The Beast of Berlin. And then Creel also sent out guys, 75,000 guys that were labeled as 4-minute men. And these men had one job, to give short speeches on Liberty bonds, the need to conserve food and fuel, and then any other topics that might be timely, concerning the war effort. So moving on to the next one, enforcing loyalty and putting down dissent. So by arousing public opinion to such a frenzy, the war efforts oftentimes spawn some pretty grotesque campaigns of Americanism and witch hunting. Popular prejudice equated anything German with disloyalty. So what does this mean for German Americans? Number one, they're going to be targeted, for acts of violence, acts of mob violence, acts of espionage, and anything else that might be deemed as un-American or harming the war effort. Symphonies refused to perform classical music written by Bach and Beethoven. Schools dropped German language classes. And then you saw towns change their names if it had a German sounding town or a German sounding town name, or if it was rooted in German heritage, they would change the name. Sauerkraut turned into Liberty cabbage. German measles turned into Liberty measles. Dachshund hounds turned into Liberty pups. And unfortunately, Wilson knew or kind of foresaw these consequences. He said that once we lead these people into war, they'll forget that there ever was such a thing as tolerance. What he failed to leave out, though, is that Wilson's actually going to lead the effort to suppress civil liberties during and after the war, and he does this under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Under these acts, Congress was able to suppress criticism of government leaders and war policies. The Espionage Act imposed penalties of up to $10,000 and 20 years in prison for anyone who gave aid to the enemy, who tried to incite insubordination, disloyalty, or refusal of duty in the armed services, or who sought to interfere with the war effort. The Sedition Act extended the penalties to those who said or did anything to obstruct the government sale of war bonds, or to advocate cutbacks in production, or just in case something had been overlooked, for saying, writing, or printing anything, quote, disloyal, profane, or abusive, end quote, about the American form of government, the Constitution, or the Army and Navy. As a result of these espionage and sedition acts, more than 1,000 convictions were handed out. Socialists and other radicals were the primary target. There was a congressman, a socialist congressman from Milwaukee, Victor Berger, received a 20-year sentence for editorials in the Milwaukee Leader that called the war a capitalist conspiracy. Eugene Debs, somebody that we've talked to ever since the 1894 American Railway Union, led the Pullman strike. Eugene Debs, a primary socialist candidate for most presidential elections in the first part of the 20th century, who had polled over 900,000 votes for president in 1912, repeatedly urged men to refuse to serve in the military, even though he knew he could be prosecuted for such remarks under the Espionage Act. Quote says, "I would 1,000 times rather to be a free soul in jail than a sycophant and a coward in the streets." He received his wish. Debs got arrested and received a 10-year prison sentence for encouraging draft resistance. In 1920, still in jail, and this is the impressive thing, the man's in jail and he gets 1 million votes for president. Woodrow Wilson, to kind of give you where he was in the times, Woodrow Wilson, even though he's a progressive, refused to grant a pardon to Debs. Debs won't be granted a pardon until the 1920s. Two important Supreme Court decisions that come out of these acts. One was Schenck versus the United States. This reaffirmed the conviction of a man for circulating anti-draft leaflets among members of the armed forces. This is where we got the precedence that you cannot yell fire in a movie theater, for it might cause a panic and have innocent bystanders become injured. And that your freedom of speech is limited if it presents a clear and present danger. In another court case, Abrams versus the United States, same year, the court upheld the conviction of a man who circulated pamphlets opposing American intervention in Russia to oust the Bolsheviks. Remember, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, had established a communist dictatorship after removing the Tsar. So those are two court cases that were tried under these acts that, once again, showed that this freedom of speech or civil liberties could be, in fact, limited in times of war. And so the next part, the last part we want to look at is the nation's factories, go into war. And what's weird is that Woodrow Wilson's administration did not invite Americans to support the war effort, and in fact ordered them to do so. And so, looking at the United States, how prepared was it for going to war in 1917? It was not very prepared at all. We do not have a large army or navy. We don't have, a large industrial sector devoted to arms and munition dealing. So we totally have to revamp the way revamp the whole structure of our economy when we're transitioning from a peacetime consumer economy to a wartime economy. So the first thing that we want to do with looking at Wilson's plan for mobilization is looking at how is he going to tackle the problem of growing an army. And he does this by conscription or the Selective Service Act. The Selective Service Act is going to be, it's a military draft. And it's going to say that all men ages 21 to 30, and it's later going to be extended out, all men ages 18 to 45 could be drafted for military service. And so when it's all said and done, around 2 million Americans are going to cross over the Atlantic, and about 1.4 million are going to see some combat, including at least 42,000 African Americans who are going to serve in segregated combat units. The other factors here, mobilizing a nation and looking at industry, labor, and some problems that are going to come out of this. Complete economic mobilization on the home front is necessary, or was necessary, to conduct this war effort efficiently. And so we saw that in 1916, we already had a Council of National Defense, which was created, which in turn led to a creation of other wartime agencies. For instance, the Food Administration is going to be headed up by Herbert Hoover, who's going to be president in 1928. And the Food Administration sought to raise agricultural production while reducing civilian consumption of food. The slogan for the Food Administration was that food will win the war. And so you saw Hoover directing a national conservation campaign by promoting things like meatless Tuesdays, wheatless Wednesdays, porkless Saturdays. He advocated the planting of victory gardens. He said that we need to become more creative in using leftovers. He encouraged people to become members of the Clean Plate Club, where you don't waste any food. You eat all the food off your plate. There used to be a jingle that would encourage children to get involved in this Clean Plate Club campaign, and it went something like this. No, I'm not going to sing it to you. That would be embarrassing on many different levels. Other ways we mobilized the economy. There was the creation of the War Industries Board that pretty much, gave this guy Bernard Baruch essentially a virtual dictatorship over the United States economy. Under the WIB, or the War Industries Board, you could see that the government told the industries, told the factories what they needed to produce, how much they needed to produce of that product, and when they needed it by. This board could allocate raw materials, order the construction of new plants, and with the approval of the president, they could actually even fix prices. And so, you really see under this wartime economy, the government is definitely taking a large and unprecedented role in the economy and in the industry. It smacks of socialism on some accounts, and you can go even further, and you could talk about how the federal government nationalized the railroads during this time to make sure that the products and the war materials and the raw materials were getting to the proper places and at the proper time. So with labor, definitely when you see the men leaving for war, there's going to be a labor shortage of the workforce. So how do we deal with this? To meet this, you see women, African Americans, and other ethnic minorities were encouraged to enter these industries and take on jobs that were usually dominated by white men. Northern businessmen sent recruiting agents into southern states to find workers for the factories and mills. And when it was all said and done, over 400,000 southern blacks began what was known as a Great Migration northward during the war years. And this is going to be a mass movement that continued throughout the 1920s and completely changed the political and social dynamics of these northern cities. These recruiting agents and these newspaper editors portray the North as a land of promise for Southern blacks, suffering from the region's depressed agricultural economy and that rise in racial intimidation and violence that the blacks had been experiencing at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. To quote an African-American Chicago newspaper, it said, "To die from the bite of frost is far more glorious than at the hands of the mob." And by 1930, the number of African Americans living in the North was triple that of 1910. Mexican Americans followed the same pattern in Texas and the far west. These newcomers were not always welcome. You saw race riots break out all over the major urban cities like Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, and for the same reasons. The same reasons that you saw the xenophobia break out when the new immigrants were coming in the late 19th century. And the whole fear that white Americans had during the Reconstruction years, this new labor force, what would it do to the status quo? What would it do to the majority's economic security? When we look at women and the war, when we look at women, we'll take that